Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. I have done quite a few different videos detailing various gender-affirming body piercings that are specifically gender-affirming for different trans folks. We've talked about triangle piercings for transmasculine folks. We've talked about PA piercings for trans feminine folks, and quite possibly the most requested next up in this series is to talk about outer labia piercings for transmasculine folks. And I love doing projects that incorporate these piercings, and I love how much gender affirmation these piercings can provide. So let's dive into them a little bit more today in the context of being a very gender-affirming piercing for trans men and transmasculine individuals. Now, just a quick note on language before we get started. Anytime I do these videos, I tend to use just the anatomical terms because everyone has a different comfort level with what language they prefer to use to refer to their own body parts. Individualized language is something that you can discuss with your piercer, and if you'd like to see me do a whole video on variations of individualized language that can be a little bit more affirming, let me know. But for the purpose of this video, because I want this information to be as accessible to as many people as possible, I'm just going to be using anatomical terms because that is going to get this information across to as many people as possible, make it as easy for this to be translated as possible, and just make sure that more people can access this information that could be really helpful to them as a part of their transition. But if this is not the language that you would personally use to refer to yourself with these body parts, it's not language you have to use in reference to yourself, and you are more than welcome to find alternative terms that feel more comfortable for you. Now, amongst the gender-affirming genital piercing work that I do, outer labia piercings are some of the most gender-affirming, and how these work for that is they create the sensation and the experience of having a scrotum. So when we think about vulva anatomy, it is primarily internal anatomy, and that affects so much more of the way we interact with the world than we realize. It affects how we stand with legs closed, how we sit with legs crossed, how we walk, how we move, how we interact with the world. These little subtle movements and gestures and experiences that we just innately do because our anatomy is more internal. And when we think about folks who have external anatomy, it does the same thing. It changes the way they sit down, the way they stand, the way they walk, the way they carry themselves. There is that external anatomy that they have to be mindful of in clothing, with movement, all of these things. And outer labia piercings, typically done for the purpose of gender affirmation, so done at a bit of a larger gauge and designed to be wearing slightly larger rings once fully healed, create that sensation of external anatomy. Now, funnily enough, when we think about what is frustrating about healing outer labia piercings, for most cisgender clients, it is the fact that the jewelry is very large and very external, and people aren't used to that. So it rubs, it snags, it catches, it can get twisted up in your underwear and in your pants and be really uncomfortable. You can sit down on it the wrong way and it can hurt and put pressure on it. There's anyone who has healed outer labias knows there's that feeling when you're walking where you're like, oh, something is not right in my underwear, I need to fix things. And this is typically a negative side effect of this piercing. This is a portion of the healing process that a lot of folks don't enjoy. But for many trans folks, this portion of this piercing and the way it interacts with their body and forces them to sit differently and stand differently and move differently is incredibly gender affirming because it's replicating that feeling of having external anatomy. Now, one of the most rewarding setups of this project that I've done was for a client of mine when I worked in South Florida who gave me permission to anonymously share his story, but he had been out and living as a trans man for over a decade and had kind of been back and forth on phalloplasty or some kind of bottom surgery, but ultimately decided that it was just not right for him between risk of surgical complications, how much downtime it would be from work and from life and from his family, and just wasn't really sure that the results were what he wanted, but knew that he wanted something to feel differently down there. And when we were doing the consultation and talking, he had gotten the idea to do this from listening to folks in the kink community talk and complain about some of their fresh outer labia piercings. And he got to thinking well, I actually really like the way you're walking and standing and moving with these. I know that you're complaining that this is very awkward and uncomfortable for you, but I think you look super masculine the way you're moving around with this, and I think this sounds like something that could work for me. So he came to me and let me know what his idea and his concept for this piercing was, and I was like, this is so cool. I'm stoked. I know folks have used this for gender affirmation before. Let's go for it. And we initially pierced him at an 8 gauge with some captive bead rings and let them heal. And I vividly remember getting a message from him like 3 weeks after we did the piercing, and it was a long message, and he was like, "This is one of the most annoying piercings I've ever healed. They get caught all the time. I like have to wear different underwear. I constantly have to like adjust myself in my underwear like while I'm out and about. It is so annoying getting in and out of my car and like accidentally sitting on them and them getting twisted up in my clothes. And it's so frustrating and it's so uncomfortable, and it's the best piercing that I've ever had. And it makes me feel so comfortable in my body. And I catch myself in the mirror, like walking by storefronts, and I feel like I'm walking like a man. I feel like I'm standing like a man. I feel like this has done more for me getting viewed as a man in public than a lot of the clothing I wear, than a lot of the haircuts I've gotten. Like, it's been such a subtle change to the way I carry myself, but such a powerful change to the way that I carry myself. And he ultimately healed those piercings. We ended up stretching them to a 6 gauge and getting very large diameter rings with some weighted beads to really create like a heft and a sensation of having something down there. And he loves them, and to this day is still wearing them, is still stoked on the project. And since then, I have replicated this project for many other trans men and transmasculine individuals with quite a bit of success. And for me, it is so cool to see the differences that this project creates in person. Like, I will do consultations with my clients before I pierce them, and to see folks come down and just do the knee jerk, like sit down, cross their legs, hop in the chair in the piercing room, and then to see them again months later after they're pierced, after they're healed, they're just coming in for like a jewelry change or something else, and to see them sit down and like keep their legs spread or change how they're walking around the studio, and see that there are these differences in their movement to accommodate for having these piercings. And it's just so wonderful to see it in practice so clearly. You know, like triangles, PAs, they have a lot of gender affirmation for different folks. They can do different things, but that gender affirmation doesn't always show physically to other people when they're seeing how you're interacting with the world. And this is one that really can create that affirmation and create almost like that masculinization of your body movements and how you carry yourself that is very plain for other people to see. And I think that is incredible. Now, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details of actually getting this piercing done, what you can expect from the process, what you can expect from healing, and what you should know before jumping in on these piercings. Because don't get too excited. I know the gender affirmation element can be really exciting and really cool, but these piercings are still a big commitment. So let's talk about all of the things you should understand first. To start is that these are anatomy-dependent piercings. Outer labia piercings, like any other piercing, especially any other genital piercing, are very, very anatomy-dependent. There needs to be enough tissue for us to pierce and have it be stable, and the way the tissue lays at rest needs to accommodate for these piercings to lay well and be stable. Now, that being said, most folks, if we're just looking at their outer labias, probably have the anatomy to get this piercing done. It is really rare that if I'm just looking at the labia themselves, that there is something that would make me decline being able to pierce. Now, that being said, it's not just the anatomy of the outers that we have to consider when we're doing this piercing. We also have to consider the way all of the surrounding tissue is going to affect how this piercing sits. And yes, this does mean that I'm talking about your thighs, your legs, everything else in the area. So for example, if you've got really good anatomy for an outer labia piercing, but the way your thighs come together when you stand is going to put a lot of pressure on the piercings or cause them to sit at funky angles, potentially could cause migration, irritation, just a lot of different issues with these piercings. So that is something that we need to account for when we're talking about anatomy and we're placing these piercings. If you have anatomy where the angle that is perpendicular through the tissue of your labia and is going to be placed well and heals well is not going to flow well with the movement of your thighs when you're walking or you're running, that is something that we have to consider when we consider doing these piercings. So not only do we want a client to have really suitable anatomy for where we're placing the piercing in the outers, we also want to make sure that the surrounding anatomy isn't going to negatively impact the piercings or their ability to heal. Now, this is not to say that if you have larger thighs or thighs that touch when you stand, you can't get these piercings. I have plenty of clients who have thighs that touch when they stand, who are larger, who wear these piercings and wear them comfortably and great. But the angle at which your thighs come together, how they put pressure on the outers, how that would affect placement is all something that we have to consider when we're talking about doing a project like this, especially if the goal is to create the sensation of external genitalia and the weight and the heft of it. How we angle these piercings and how they're going to hang and sit when you're standing, laying, moving, all of that is going to be affected heavily by the anatomy of the area, but also the anatomy of your thighs. So these are all elements that should be being considered when someone is doing these piercings for you. And what that looks like is I'll typically mark these with a client laying down, and then I'll also have the client stand and I'll check those marks standing. Sometimes I'll double check them in different body positions, but we just check them in lots of different ways to ensure that they're going to be placed correctly with your anatomy and they're going to be functional and comfortable in your day-to-day life. Now, when we are initially piercing outers, we can use both rings and curved barbells for these. Rings are going to be the more common and popular choice, and rings is typically what I prefer on most anatomies. Captive bead rings are pretty affordable. They're really easy to pierce with. They're really easy to heal with. They leave plenty of room for swelling, and I find that they're typically the ideal option. Now, in some circumstances, the movement or weight of the rings immediately, especially when we talk about thighs that are going to potentially put pressure on these piercings, can sometimes be too much. So there are some circumstances in some anatomies where I do find piercing these initially with a curved barbell is a better bet. Now, that being said, curves do have their own drawbacks. They need to be downsized very, very early on. Otherwise, they tend to want to sit all the way to one side or all the way to the other. And this can cause migration and irritation bumps and issues during the healing process. So curves really have to be used when it's situationally appropriate, that they would be the better style for someone's anatomy. This is all something that you should be discussing with your piercer, and they should be honest with you about what they feel like is going to be best for your anatomy and work best for your lifestyle and your needs. But curves can be an option for some people's anatomy. Now, the more important factor with initial jewelry is initial size. I won't do outers thinner than a 10 gauge. I just don't find that they're very stable at a 12 and definitely not at a 14. This is a placement that can be pretty prone to migration and rejection, especially when it's pierced too thin. Cheese wire effect is a bitch in any placement, but especially when we talk about genital piercings. Now, I have a whole blog post that goes in depth on cheese wire effect if you'd like to learn more about it, but it's really important with these piercings that we're doing them large enough to be stable. And if your goal is to get gender affirmation out of these piercings, you're probably gonna wanna wear them larger or thicker anyway, so that way you can wear that larger jewelry when you're fully healed that's gonna give you that same effect and that same experience from them. So if your anatomy permits, we can definitely start these as large as an 8 gauge or even a 6 gauge, again, anatomy depending. But I absolutely would not get these done any smaller than a 10 gauge. And that goes doubly for if you are taking testosterone because of the effects of bottom growth and the thickening of changes of the tissue in this area. It's really important that we're doing these piercings large enough to be stable. So if you are on testosterone and your piercer is talking about piercing you at a 12 or even a 14 or a 16, leave. Do not get pierced by that person. That is too thin to be safe and stable with your anatomy. Now, as far as getting these piercings done, I will not lie, they can be a bit intense to get pierced. Overall, I feel like it's not too bad, but of all of the piercings I've ever gotten in my life, my outers were a little bit up there. They were pretty damn spicy. It is a thicker area to pierce, but how we pierce them is pretty straightforward. That does make them a bit of a faster piercing, so that can make the process a little bit easier. I really firmly believe in being honest with folks about what they can expect from getting a piercing, so I'm never gonna lie to you and tell you like, oh my God, it's so easy, like it's gonna be fine. My outers were really intense. That being said, I love them. I don't regret getting them. I'm super stoked that I have them, but the piercing was a bit of a process. Now, healing can be really variable with outers. I have some clients who say they were like the easiest things they ever healed. They were super simple to heal. They barely had to do anything. One of my old coworkers was like riding their bike to and from work days after getting their outers pierced. I had a pretty middle of the road healing experience. I personally dealt with some irritation bumps, nothing that was too major, and was pretty easy to get to heal and go away. And then I have some clients who do really struggle with healing their outers. We deal with irritation bumps on and off. We have to go with different jewelry styles, and we have to tweak aftercare, and it just takes a lot of work to get them to heal. This can be based off of a variety of factors from anatomy to lifestyle, how much you're moving at work, the clothing you wear at work, what you do in your free time. It can definitely be impacted by taking testosterone, and I do find that folks who are more newly on T struggle with more issues healing these than folks who've been on it for a while, as they're still experiencing some of those hormonal fluctuations and skin changes, especially in that region, that come from being early on T. Obviously, if you have different medical conditions, that can be a really big factor in affecting how these heal. So healing for these is pretty variable. I don't necessarily want to say that they're easy to heal. I don't necessarily want to say that they're hard to heal. I think clients really run the gambit of experiences healing these, so go into it hoping that you're going to be one of those people who has a really easy heal, but don't be disappointed if you're someone who does have a more difficult heal and you have to take a little bit more time with these to get them to heal well. In particular, the struggles I see people deal with are typically related to moisture, movement, and lifestyle. So moisture, I definitely saw folks struggle more to heal these in like warm, humid climates where there's just a lot of moisture and a lot of sweat. I will say clients who are prone to sweating more or having more sweat collect in that area can sometimes struggle with moisture-related irritations, and we have to add in drying to the aftercare and figure out clothing that's going to be easy to keep dry. That can be a bit of a process. Movement can be a big one. Clients who are super physically active, who are like running around at a warehouse all day, who are just kind of on their feet all the time for work in maybe less than desirable conditions, who have to wear like really compressive or really tight pants for work. All of that movement, depending on also factors like anatomy, can definitely also contribute to these having a more difficult time healing. And then of course, lifestyle factors. If you like ride bikes and horses and motorcycles for fun every weekend, that might be a harder healing process with your outers than if you're someone who just sits at home and watches TV and reads books every weekend. So your activity levels and how you spend your time outside of this can definitely all affect things when it comes to how these heal and irritations that you might deal with. Now, troubleshooting for these irritations should be handled one-on-one for your piercer. Without knowing someone's particular situation, anatomy, piercings, lifestyle, all of these factors, no one can really offer you accurate troubleshooting advice. So please, if you get these piercings done and you're dealing with issues, get back in touch with your piercer. Allow them to help you. It's part of our job to help you heal these piercings, so let us do so. And of course, I can't come on here and talk about outers and how awesome and affirming they can be for different folks without briefly mentioning how often these piercings are used for different kink and fetish purposes and how much there is we can do with that. Outers have very notoriously been used as part of different chastity devices, and a lot of folks find that that can be a really enjoyable way to play around with these piercings. More interestingly, and typically more gender affirming for transmasc folks, is people using these for play with different weights. So they even make like custom weighted jewelry that you can wear in these piercings, or weights that are designed to be hung off of these piercings. And a lot of folks really enjoy the sensation of weight on these piercings and find that that can be a really pleasurable sensation and also really affirming. So that is one really fun way you can play with them when they're healed. I've even had clients who have had custom strap-on rigs made that attach via these piercings. And this is a very custom project. It is not a cheap project. My client who did this spent some very pretty pennies on this, but said that it was incredibly functional and incredibly affirming to not have to wear a harness and to be able to do things with just the piercings, and that it was really a game changer for them and their partner, which is so cool. These are piercings that you can get creative with, that you can have a lot of fun and using them in different applications than you may have originally intended for them for. So while they do have a lot of gender affirmation for a lot of clients that is cool and that you can kind of just see in general, also behind closed doors, they can be really enjoyable, really pleasurable piercings in their own right. And if folks want to see me do a whole video about the different ways people use these piercings for different things, I actually don't know if YouTube would let me post something like that and keep it up, but I don't know, maybe that's a subject for a blog post or a thread on Twitter, somewhere where I can post that content, but if you're interested, let me know. But I felt like I could not make this video without touching on that element of this piercing, because that is one of the major benefits that a lot of folks find from this setup. These can be such wonderfully gender-affirming piercings. I gotta tell you what, there is something to be said for the feeling of just having to like adjust yourself in your pants casually, and once you get comfortable with that movement and that motion, it is really gender-affirming. It is really gender-affirming. And these piercings just bring so many little things to you with that. Now, that being said, some people do get these piercings for gender affirmation and find that they are just too uncomfortable. They don't like the feeling of them getting caught and tangled and snagged and things like this. And if that is you, I want to take a moment to say that that is totally fine. If you find that you are just really struggling to adapt your lifestyle and your body movements to these, you don't have to. We can just get you smaller fitted rings or barbells that are out of the way, that don't get caught and tangled so often, that don't deal with all of those factors, and you can just wear them the way folks traditionally wear them. But for folks who can adjust how they walk, how they stand, who are comfortable adjusting the underwear they wear and the fit of their clothing, the gender affirmation that comes from doing so with these piercings is incredible. I cannot overstate just how affirming I see this setup be for so many clients. So if it's something you are possibly interested in doing, hopefully this video helps you get some information and education about the process. And I wish you so much luck in finding a piercer near you who offers services like this and who's willing to work with you on an affirming project like this one. Thanks so much for sitting down and hanging out and letting me chat about something that I am so incredibly passionate about. If you'd like to see some of my projects like this that I've done and you are over 18, you can check that out on my genital piercing portfolio on my website. You can also see more frequent uploads of work over on my Twitter page. And I can't wait to sit down and chat with y'all again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.